Okay, my name is Darren Gertis. It is Tuesday, July 19th, and this is what's going on in Ukraine. And if you're new, I do a daily update where I'm just trying to explain all the events. But usually, the events, as I aggregate the news, a theme comes out of it. And the theme today is more geopolitical than military, but I'll touch on the military first. So, the Russians continue to shell in various places. Our enemy shelled our region twice today, so it attacked Nikopol, Riviev, districts again. There's another article here. Slovansk mayor is saying, unfortunately, Slovansk has been shelled again. Private houses are damaged. There are people under the rubble. There are casualties. Okay, so the shelling continues, but they're not really making a lot of ground, at least not according to the UK Ministry of Defense. Despite heavy use of artillery, this is Radio Free Europe. Russia is making minimal gains in Donbass. Outnumbered Ukrainian defenders continue to hold the line in the east against Russian forces who are only making minimal gains. And those reports are pretty consistent. The tempo has slowed down significantly. There's not really a lot more to see in that article that I'm not going to say elsewhere. Okay, now I want to talk to political events. The big news was that Putin visited Tehran, that is the capital of Iran, and so it was trilateral talks between Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Here's how RT carried it. RT is Russian television, and if you don't watch or read RT, you probably ought to just see how they're interpreting things. It's sometimes like looking through a funhouse mirror. Okay, on Tuesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Iran for a fifth time. This trip is the fourth in the last 7 years, so that tempo has increased significantly. Okay, the role of Iran has been underestimated for many years. More precisely, it has been completely misjudged. The reason is simple. Our Western oriented expert community looked at Iran mainly through the American led prism, a rogue community, mullahs with missiles, and a desire for a nuclear bomb, theocracy, repressive regime, and it goes on and on. Okay, but Putin's cozying up to Iran. Why? Well, he kind of has to. If Europe and North America are cut off, then where do I go? Well, I can go to China. China wants to be very careful. China's not saying no, but China is being very careful not to get sanctioned. India's been kind of like, yeah, sell us your oil cheap. Middle East, and the Middle East doesn't seem to have nearly the problem with Putin's aggression as what Europe has. Okay, however, we are now moving toward a comprehensive strategy cooperation treaty, one that can last for 20 or 25 years. It was presented to the Iranian draft of Vladimir Putin in Moscow last month. Sergei Lavrov brought the Russian version to Tehran, so they're talking about how they're going to play nice with each other. Now, who you are, your mom probably told you that who your friends are is who you are, and that's kind of what's going on here. And so uh, Russia is now, as Russia's being isolated from the West, they're looking to other people, other countries, in order to kind of build new coalitions. There's no need to think that the Russians' conflict with the West has made it irrelevant. The potential for North-South trade is still enormous, even if the war of sanctions between Russia and the EU lasts for a long time. The corridor will be needed for Russia's trade with the Middle East and Asia, and so that's where Russia's looking right now. Okay, that's how RT carried this. Now, I again triangulate, read RT, and then read Western news. So this is the British Guardian. Peace will be on Russia's terms, says former president as it happened. So former President Medvedev said that peace will be on Russia's terms, and he didn't say much more than that. Usually he's long-winded and bombastic. Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran added that Tehran and Moscow needed to stay vigilant against Western deception. Again, they both see America as, like Putin called America in his February 24th speech, the empire of lies, which is kind of rich coming from Putin. Calling for long-term cooperation between Iran and Russia. I quote, Iran and Russia's long-term cooperation is deeply beneficial to both countries, he said. Then Putin also was pointing out the progress that had been made with Ukrainian wheat. Now, this was a legit thing. They have made progress. May allow Russia to lift the blockade on Ukrainian wheat. And he's talking to Erdogan. I want to thank you for your mediation efforts, he said to Turkish President Erdogan. Now, Turkey was involved because Turkey commands the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. During a trip to Tehran, in his comments released by the Kremlin, with your mediation, we have moved forward. Not all issues have yet been resolved, but the fact that there is movement is already good. Now, why would Russia want to, work with this? They would be allowing Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea, but in the process, they would also be able to sell their grain, and that is money that's coming into their coffers. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, but it's at least Ukrainian grain is getting out. Russian grain will get out. Uh, Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Africans and Asians who are depending on that grain will not starve. Okay, this was the Medvedev quote, Russia will achieve all its goals. There will be peace on our terms, which means once they capture a bunch of land, they're going to annex it and, declare it Russian territory or a free state that's allied to Russia, and then, say, no, the Ukrainians, they're bad. They keep firing on us. We just want peace. But that's what's going to happen. Okay, now, here's RT again. NATO would have started a war if not stopped by Russia. Huh? NATO wasn't saber rattling. NATO didn't start this, but this is what's going on. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, declared on Tuesday that had not Russian President Vladimir Putin taken the initiative in Ukraine, the NATO alliance would have launched a war with Russia over Crimea. There was no fight in NATO to go after Crimea. It had been going on for 8 years. There was nothing like that. Khamenei stated that as regards Ukraine, if you do not take the initiative, the other side would have initiated the war. Like, I'm not sure what bizarro world he's living in, but that's not the reality. There was no taste for this, and it was only when the Western powers saw that Ukraine was clearly a victim, being just overrun by an enemy, a bully, an aggressor, 3 times its size, that they went, you know what, this isn't okay. So maybe you can charge the West with being apathetic, as they were, but this that's not a legit interpretation. Okay, describing the West as completely opposed to a strong and independent Russia. Yeah, well, they're not opposed to a strong and independent Russia. They're opposed to a strong and independent Russia that then bullies its neighbors or knocks over or tries to topple the government of its neighbor or whatever else. That's what they're opposed to. And NATO as dangerous entity that sees no boundaries in its expansionistic policy. You know, it's fascinating because we he's talking about NATO being expansionistic. This is what Putin is doing, is being expansionistic and actually overrunning its neighbor in order to seize territory. So it's sometimes bizarre seeing what's said. Uh, the Iranian leader added that had they not been stopped in Ukraine, they would have launched the same war sometime later under the pretext of the Crimean issue. Whoa, the West keeps saying unless the Russians are not stopped in Ukraine, they will go on and expand. It's like this weird. It's almost, I feel gaslighted reading these articles. Okay, NATO considers Crimea to be illegally annexed to Ukrainian territory. That is finally the first thing that is true here that I agree with. NATO does consider that illegally annexed. Crimea was annexed, and in fact, I'm going to be bringing a whole episode out about Crimea, but it was annexed eh, with a 97% vote rate. Okay, now you don't get a 97% vote anywhere in a democratic world. And again, go and watch the explainer that will come out here shortly about Crimea. You don't get a 97% vote rate anywhere in a democratic world without something going like wrong. The only U.S. presidents other than George Washington that had more than 60% of the vote were LBJ and Richard Nixon. So 97% of the vote, it sounds great, but it actually means that something was terribly askew. and they had like 85% of the population come out to vote. And if you look at what happens in democratic countries, nowhere near that usually comes out. So it was fraudulent. That's what was going on in Crimea. Okay. Um, that's the end of this one, but let's look at the Guardian now on the same topic. So Putin endorses Iran for invasion of Ukraine, but clashes with Turkey at the summit. So Putin ended his first major summit outside of Russia since the invasion of Ukraine with an endorsement from Iran and its response to NATO, and you just heard about those, and a clash with Turkey over Syria. What's going on? Okay, so there's some geopolitical realities going on here. So Moscow claimed that it showed Russia remained respected in the Middle East, but the Middle East is not monolithic. Like we have this view as Americans that like they're all like this in the Middle East. They're really not. There's all these different factions. Putin praised the Turkish leader for mediating talks on the export of grain from grain from Ukraine, saying there had been some progress. And there had been some progress, and that's good. And that's good for Ukraine, and it's good for Russia, and it's good for the rest of the world that won't starve. Let me show you what's actually going on with Ukrainian grain. Look at this. This is Radio Free Europe. Ukraine wheat burns as food crisis looms. Like the fields are literally being burned, or there's missile attacks on grain silos. There's, I mean, that is what's going on. So they're destroying Ukraine's ability to be able to export its wheat, but they are making progress on the export treaties. Okay, let me go back. Okay, so the EU agreed to unfreeze economic resources owned by 7 top Russian lenders as long as it could be shown that the resources are necessary for the purchase, import, or transport of agriculture, food, and products, including wheat and fertilizers. So the EU made this concession. Now, while money goes back into Russian coffers, the EU is making this concession because now it's also looking at the Africans and Asians and whoever else that might be dependent on the export of this grain. Um, okay, so Aragon has been leading the efforts to broker the deal whereby grain can leave the ports as long as the ships are independently expected for armaments. That last clause was a Russian concern that they would smuggle armaments back into the country through grain. Now, why is Aragon doing it? This is the Black Sea. Here's Turkey is this gray area, and so Turkey controls the export of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So that's why this is such a big deal, and why Turkey's involved. Now, Putin won the endorsement of Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, for the invasion of Ukraine. Like he was like, "Oh, yeah, this is a great idea. War is harsh," said the Ayatollah, and we're not pleased that ordinary people suffer. But in the case of Ukraine, if you had not taken the initiative, the other side would have caused the war with its own initiative, which is what he was saying about NATO, and NATO's bad in the West, and Americans are the devil and that kind of thing. Putin echoed Iran's judgment and said that he had no choice but to invade, saying no one's in favor of war and the loss of ordinary people's lives is a great tragedy, but the behavior of the West made us have no choice but to react. Okay, really? No, that's not. Okay, we were against Ukraine's membership in NATO, but we agreed under American pressure, said some European countries. Okay, so he's trying to make the case that it's the evil America causing what's going on. The atmosphere was not of cordial consensus that Russia and Iran displayed was not shared by Aragon. Why? What was going on when it came to his ambitions to intervene in northern Syria? So Aragon has his own agenda. Like Russia has its agenda, Iran has its agenda, Turkey has a very different agenda. The Turkish president has been preparing a fresh military incursion of his own into Syria to construct a buffer zone of the south of the Turkish-Syrian border. Okay, so he wants to invade part of Syria in order to create a buffer zone against what he perceives as his enemies. Let's look at the map. So here's Turkey and Syria. We don't think about like where Turkey is. Like we kind of get they're kind of in Europe, kind of in Asia. They're really that bridge country between the two. Here's Syria, and here's this buffer zone area that he wants to construct in northern Syria. Why does he want to do that? Well, because the Kurds are there. So let's keep reading. So he claims the buffer zone would shield Turkey from attacks by Syrian Kurds led by US-backed YPG militia. So, Okay, we're playing Axis and Allies now. Think about what's going on here. You've heard the name the Kurds before. Where did you hear the Kurds before? Well, if you look at a map like this orange area is land that is held, or land where the Kurds live. And so you've heard the term Kurds when we're talking about roll back the clock a decade in Iraq. The Kurds were America's closest ally, doing their level best to fight in Iraq. And they were doing a phenomenal job. Now, the Kurds also live in Turkey. They're like a fifth, two-fifths of the country, something in that neighborhood. And Turkey doesn't really like the Kurds, but so why are there so many Kurds here? Well, that's because after World War II, when they drew the maps of Europe, or partly after World War One, even when the maps of Europe were withdrawn, it was just kind of this arbitrary, let's cut here, let's cut here, and this people group didn't really get much of a say about it, and so they spill over all these borders. So there's no Kurdistan, there's no Kurdish state. It's this state within a state, or this people group within a state. And so it's just this bizarre kind of thing. And Aragon has some significant issues with the Kurds. But the Kurds are like America's best friend. Like, they have been the most consistent fighters in Iraq, toppling bad guys. And it's really an interesting, bizarre thing about how the different groups get together. Khomeini expresses broad objections to a fresh Turkish incursion. Well, why? Because it would be to the detriment of Syria, and Khomeini likes Syria. Okay, so there's another weird uh, love triangle, for a lack of a better term, between Iran and Syria and Russia. Okay, so Russia, well, let's go up here. Russia, Iran, and Syria are on the same page. Now, there's also an anti-triangle, and that is that Saudi Arabia hates Iran. Turkey, they can deal with Iran, but they hate the Kurds, and Syria is, like, their issue with Syria is the Kurds. It's not even Bashar al-Assad, who is the dictator over there, who is gassing his own people. Like, that's not even his issue. So there's this weird, like, Saudi Arabia and Iran hate each other. Um, Iran and Syria are the okay. So part of that is that, look, Saudi Arabia. There's two factions in Islam. There's the Sunni and the Shiite. Okay, the Shiite are kind of headquartered in Iran and supporting Syria and supporting parts of Lebanon and the PLO. And so Israel hates Iran because this is like where the lion's share of terrorism comes from. They're not exactly keen on Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia, for the most part, is Sunni. And other than the Wahhabis, they tend to be cool. Okay, the Wahhabis are those that are like these really militant types, the Osama bin Laden types. Okay, so that's what's going on. There's this really intricate play here in the Middle East. Okay, so back to where we are. Aragon, speaking at the start of the trilateral meeting, appeared to assert his unilateral right to mount an invasion, saying it was not possible to expect Turkey to sit idle and aloof from this problem. He claimed a 30-kilometer barrier was necessary to deal with the hotbeds of what he perceived as terrorism in Syria. So it's a hot mess over there in the Middle East. Okay, let's see what else we have here. We already covered that, covered that, covered that, and that. Okay, so next, Turkey's Bakhtar drone company will also never supply Russia, said the CEO. They will supply, we've not delivered or supplied them with anything, and we will never do such a thing because we support Ukraine, support its sovereignty, its resistance, and independence. Okay, last little bit. Senior Ukrainian officers killed in Vinnytsia strike, reports. Okay, so they're doubling down on this lie. 3 Ukrainian officers, including 2 colonels, were reportedly taken out last week. Last week's Russian attack on the city of Vinnytsia. No, they weren't, but they're making stuff up. Minsk Military Academy in Belarus said on its website that the former cadet Ukrainian Colonel Oleg Marchuk was killed, and he was presented with an award by Zelensky for defending the national territory of Ukraine. And this other guy was killed somewhere else in Berkchev in Ukraine's western Zomir region. I don't know how that has to do with Vinistra. And a post on Facebook about the funeral of a Ukrainian Air Force Colonel Dmitry Burko said he was killed in Vinistra on July 14th. If he was killed in Venetia on July 14th, it was just fortuitous from the Russian perspective. They struck this thing called the House of Officers. That's this building here. Let's look at this. This is Wikipedia of what the damage looks like. Okay, so you can see the damage, and this is the House of Officers, but it's used as a concert hall. It's formerly a military thing, but it's now used as a concert hall. This thing here is no longer a House of Officers. It's just used for um, civic venues. There was no meeting here. Nothing like that was going on there. Was it owned by the military? Yes, but it was rented out for other purposes. But they're doubling down on this argument, saying, well, we got these. The Ukrainian Air Force insisted that the building was de jure owned by the military, but de facto served as a civilian concert venue. There was no meeting there, at least not according to the Western press. And so, yeah. Okay, so that's all that I have for today. Um, Russia continues to lie. In fact, if you want to see more about this, yesterday I talked about how Russia lies and lied about this again and again. But the geopolitical realities of what's going on, you kind of have to understand like what the motivations are of all the players. Why Russia invades Ukraine? Why Ukraine says Crimea is theirs? And by the way, look for the Crimean explainer that will come out later today. Okay? Thank you for your time, and I hope that serves you well in your understanding of what's going on in Ukraine on today, Tuesday, July 19th.